education, classical education, or frankly, liberal arts education is often framed as Western or Western civilization. And one of the discussions that always comes up when I teach this class is classical education or is liberal arts education somehow restricted to classics of the Western tradition? And so I wonder, has that come up in your discussions? And if so, how do you think about the classical tradition as possibly including other kinds of traditions that may not be specifically Western?
Yeah, it's absolutely come up. I'd say this year, more than any year before, we've been asking, and once we hit this year, okay, we finally have all 4 grades. This is now our 4th time teaching 9th grade and our last time teaching a grade for the first time, right? So our last time teaching this new 12th grade for the first time. And it's kind of allowed us to take a breath and then to ask, okay, what are the big questions that we need to continue to ask together as a faculty? And at the very top is, how do we avoid ignoring the East when the East has so many important contributions, not only to education, but also to Christianity? I think sometimes we live we forget that there's a whole history and living reality of the church in the East. And even, the Catholic Church is not only the Roman Catholic Church, but there are all sorts of rites and just a diversity of traditions in the East as well in the church. And so we want to balance all of that, making sure that the students are aware of that they don't understand the church to be a purely Western institution, and they don't understand, the sequence of their education as only paying attention to the West. But that's in tension with, you're never going to be able to do everything. So any curriculum at any grade level, whether we're talking K-8 or high school or any college class, you always need to make decisions about, well, what are we going to spend most of our time on? What are we going to focus on? And what are we going to maybe mention, but we won't have time to go into as much depth as we would like to. And that's a question that we're still figuring out together as a faculty and as a school, because there are really beautiful works from the East. There are epic works from the East. There are works that deal with these big questions about the human condition and the nature of reality and the meaning of a good life, just as much in the East as they are in the West. And so we've been having a lot of conversations, especially in our history and philosophy and literature classes and departments, about how can we make room for some of those texts that we really do deserve the title of a great book, that are dealing with these important questions and these great ideas that are worth dwelling on, while also keeping a coherence and a kind of chronological approach that we have in our curriculum. So I don't have a beautiful success story of here's how you do it, but only to agree wholeheartedly that it needs to be asked and it certainly needs to be done. And classical education is not only for the West. I think it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming decades how this movement of a renewal in classical education, the liberal arts, isn't limited only to, America and what's going on here. So
that's fascinating. As I've been giving these talks and talking with people about what does it mean to do classical education or liberal arts education, I'm really interested, and Scala is really interested in paying attention to the context in which one educates. So one example, if you were to found a classical school, it just comes to mind, right, in Minneapolis, which has a large population from Ethiopia. One might want to intentionally look for aspects of the tradition of the community that is immigrated there that could be thought of as expressing the culture of excellence and the intellectual history of another part of the world. And there's a Scala advisor, a faculty advisor to Scala, Hank Edmondson, who teaches on the liberal arts tradition in China. And he works with a school that teaches Chinese classical civilization and Western, the Western tradition of the liberal arts together, and teaching the students both, right? So sometimes what has been argued, at least in higher ed where I teach, is that because the liberal arts tradition, for the most part, let's admit it, has been taught as the Western tradition, and there's a canon, and we have to maintain this canon, then in order to promote diversity and talk about other cultures, it's led to a dismantling of the canon, or a dismantling of the idea that there is a core curriculum. And so what I like about your approach, or some of the other approaches that I've heard of, is that one can maintain that there is something of a set of books that have shaped Western civilization that should be encountered, while also acknowledging that books and ideas from other cultures have shaped civilizations that have had amazing religious flourishing. And as you put it, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Right.
And to be intentional about looking for those traditions and presenting them as worthwhile of study, as worthwhile of approaching, even if it's not one's own culture. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And could you give an example of a book or a piece of art or something that you think represents perhaps an Eastern classical tradition?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had more off the top of my head. I was talking with a friend of mine who's worked in classical education for decades, and he was telling me about a text. I think it's a Confucian text, and I can't remember the name of it. But the conversation was about how classical educators don't need to be afraid of texts in the East, because the main point of classical education is not that we're Western, but that we believe in the existence of truth and goodness and beauty. We believe in the ability of human beings to come to know and believe and love those things more clearly. And so no one culture or no one civilization has a monopoly on that task or has a monopoly on that endeavor. And so we can see texts from China and India and even Ethiopia and other, I know there's a great epic, I think originally written in Mali, that one of my teachers was telling me about, as like, hey, could we add this epic? You know, we read the Iliad and the Odyssey, so why not incorporate this other epic that no one knows about barely, but it's super interesting, and there's so many questions to be engaged with in the classroom with this type of book. So yeah, I think this is an area where we're just starting to dig deeper and to scratch the surface, but I think it's absolutely work that can and should be done by more teachers at more schools.
Well, look, I'm keeping a list of unanswered questions or new questions every time I teach this course, but I would just say that I think that what you're doing and what we're talking about is a way of assisting the internationalization of education. And in some ways, we now live in a global world and people are all accessing materials, but there's a way in which the classical liberal arts tradition doesn't have to replace another tradition as it spreads. It can actually perhaps help other traditions recover their own classics and recover their own traditions, which is what I understand the classical Chinese school is doing. They're teaching classical Chinese civilization in a way that most Chinese schools aren't doing.
Yeah.
And they've been inspired by the classical education system of coming out of the United States to rediscover a tradition that got replaced by a largely STEM focused education in China. And so I think that the image of dialogue, as you set out before, right, that this is a journey of discovery, and the Western tradition, it frankly is the starting point of most liberal arts schools and curriculums, but it can be a starting point that's open and can bring out aspects of other traditions that may have been lost, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.